Britons are heading to the polls today to choose the next party to lead the country. This is after Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced the snap elections in May. Voters in 650 constituencies across the UK will elect members of Parliament to the lower chamber and the House of Commons. Let's now get a take from the Voice of America's reporter, Henry Ridgwell, who is joining us from London. Henry, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. Just before we get into some of the details in relation to the election, tell us about the atmosphere in the UK ahead of the polls.
Well, it's, I think, one of a jaded electorate. There's not too much excitement about this election, not much expectation of great change or optimism. It's one of really resignation and also a demand for change. So very much a protest vote. The country has been led for 14 years by the Conservative Party, of course, and I think the mood is that it's time for change, but it's an environment where there is economic malaise, there is an inflation crisis, there is rising unemployment. People are struggling and public services are not in good shape either. And I think many people understand that while they get a chance to vote today to possibly change the government, as polls suggest, that things aren't probably going to improve anytime soon. So while there is optimism for those parties, particularly Labour, who appear to be on course for victory, I think they will also realise that there is an uphill battle ahead to gain the trust of the electorate and to try to inject some kind of bounce and optimism into the country.
Yeah, and here's the thing about it. If you consider that the Conservative Party has been in charge for so long, 14 to 15 years now, and we had the Labour Party last winning the elections, has not won the elections rather, since 2005. What is it though about the Labour Party that has made it incapable of encroaching in the instability of the Conservative Party, also taking into consideration the number of prime ministers that the UK has had under the leadership of the Conservative Party?
Well, I think then you have to look back to the political history of the last decade and a half or so, going back to when David Cameron came to power as part of that coalition government in 2010. And that was perhaps a more buoyant time, although, of course, he came to power after the 2008-9 international debt crisis. And there was a period, I suppose, a honeymoon political period then for him, until he took that gamble of allowing a referendum on Britain's EU membership. And really, that's where the instability for the Conservative Party entered. Of course, as we all know, the British electorate voted to leave the European Union, and David Cameron resigned. And that triggered that series of 5 different prime ministers now over the past 8 years for the Conservatives. Now, why have Labour failed to be able to capitalise on that? I guess you have to look at the leadership and the timings of those elections. So, of course, in 2019, the last election, we had Boris Johnson, who was a very popular figure then. This is, of course, before the coronavirus pandemic, before those revelations of lockdown parties in Downing Street and so on. He was a popular figure. Aside from his politics, he was up against Jeremy Corbyn, who was largely ridiculed and hated by much of the media in the UK, and it saw Boris Johnson gain a majority of close to 100 seats. And the past 5 years since then, we've seen Boris Johnson forced to resign following those series of scandals, including those parties in Downing Street. We had Theresa May. She was forced to resign after failing to get the Brexit deal through. Liz Truss, whose premiership lasted just 1 month as the markets crashed and sterling crashed after her economic policies were largely seen as unfunded. And since then, Rishi Sunak, of course, has taken over to try to steady the ship, but he's failed to inspire the electorate, even failed to inspire many of his own Conservative voters. And the Tories are now being attacked on all sides, really, not only from the left or perhaps or the centre ground by Labour, who very much want to be seen as that stable centre ground party under Keir Starmer, but also on the right by the Reform Party under Nigel Farage. So they will be expected to lose plenty of votes to them, and Reform could be expected to gain a handful of seats. But because of their share of the vote, they will take votes from the Tories. That could hand other seats to other parties like Labour and the Liberal Democrats. So I think a difficult time for the Conservative Party today. All the polls predict that. And for Labour, they are expecting a victory, possibly a record, even bigger than Tony Blair's in 1997. The latest YouGov poll suggests that Labour could have a 212-seat majority. Now, you'd have to go back centuries to find such a successful result for Labour and such a disastrous result for the Conservatives.
It is an interesting one. Thank you so much, Henry. Now we wait and see that if the Conservative Party is not successful and you have the Labour Party emerging as successful in these elections, Naledi, what it would mean for geopolitics, considering where the Conservative Party is standing when it comes to Ukraine and also its relationship with the United States. So it will be a very interesting one to look out for how those polls decide who becomes the new leader of the UK.